welcome to All Out Politics. The Conservative MP, Sir Desmond Swayne, is under pressure this morning over comments that he made to an anti-vaccination campaign last November, telling them that NHS capacity figures were being manipulated to exaggerate the scale of the virus. He also said that he believed the wearing of masks to combat the virus was a matter of quote, social control. I'm going to speak to Sir Desmond in a moment. Earlier, the Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove told Sky News Sir Desmond should apologise and retract his comments. Our political correspondent Rob Powell reports.
Conservative MP Sir Desmond Swayne in November last year speaking to Save Our Rights UK, a group that's advanced false claims about the COVID vaccine and organised anti-lockdown protests. The topic of discussion, the risk posed by the virus to the NHS.
But it seems to be a manageable risk, particularly given the way that figures appear to have been manipulated. We are told that there is a deadly pandemic proceeding at the moment. That is difficult to reconcile with...
There is no evidence of figures being manipulated, and at the time of this interview, deaths were 14% above the 5-year average, according to the ONS. January the 15th this year, and Sir Desmond is giving another interview.
It is my absolute honour and pleasure to be inviting Sir Desmond Swayne to the high wire right now.
This time it's to Del Bigtree, leader of an anti-vaccination group and former producer for disgraced anti-vax medic Andrew Wakefield, where he's asked about the UK's latest lockdown.
Is there some other desire to control the people that has nothing to do with health? Where are you at with that?
There are aspects of this which I'm certain come down to social control, like the wearing of masks. Isn't it? The medical case, you've just rubbished it earlier.
Several studies have shown face masks can reduce the transmission of viruses.
Hello?
Hello, Sir Desmond.
Yeah.
Hello, hi, it's Rob Powell here, calling from Sky News. I'm a political correspondent. Sir Desmond Swayne wasn't available for an on-camera interview, but agreed to this phone call being recorded. On Del Bigtree, did you know who he was before you gave the interview?
I've never heard of Del Bigtree.
So he was someone that's anti-vaccine and has said that the COVID vaccine could be the greatest scientific blunder in the history of mankind.
I state, having a conversation with someone is not in any way associating yourself with his point of view.
You're lending the credibility of a member of parliament to some groups which have views which are not backed up by any scientific evidence.
Well, the point is this: we're a democracy. We believe in free speech and free expression.
But those who track anti-vax content online say Sir Desmond's comments will cost lives.
People, of course, have been confused by a new pathogen, a new disease which has emerged. It's caused a lot of concern. And to see a member of parliament feeding off that concern, feeding the beast, so to speak, is incredibly cynical, incredibly damaging, and will cost lives.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
The former minister in the Commons, where a valid debate will continue about easing restrictions. But at such a perilous moment in the pandemic, many will question where and how this Tory MP has chosen to have this discussion. Rob Powell, Sky News in Westminster.
Well, earlier this morning, the Minister of the Cabinet Office, Michael Gove, called on Sir Desmond Swayne to apologise for his comments.
In the case of what Sir Desmond said, I would hope that he would issue a full and complete retraction and apology for what he said. It's unacceptable.
Absent that, he should lose the whip then?
Well, I think that the first thing that should happen is that Sir Desmond should apologise, and then, of course, consideration can be given to any other steps that might be taken. But I think it's important that Sir Desmond has a chance to retract, withdraw, and say sorry for these comments.
Well, Sir Desmond can speak for himself. He joins me now live. Thank you very much indeed for being with me, Sir Desmond. I just want to ask you, first of all, whether you regret those two interviews which you gave to Save Our Rights UK and to Del Bigtree.
I certainly regret the fuss that they've caused and being at the centre of a media storm, when I would much rather the focus of today's news being on AstraZeneca and its spat with the European Union.
Do you accept that you were wrong in what you said back in November to Save Our Rights UK? It seems to be a manageable risk, particularly as the figures have been manipulated. We're told there's a deathly, deadly pandemic proceeding at the moment. That is difficult to reconcile with intensive care units actually operating at typical occupation levels for the time of year and us bouncing around at the typical level of deaths for the time of year. I mean, you were wrong, weren't you, as it turned out?
No, I think at the time, that was a legitimate point of view. I accept entirely that the situation has changed and changed dramatically as a consequence of the new variant. But I think those were perfectly legitimate and widely held views at the time.
Yeah, but they were wrong, weren't they? I mean, even at the time, I think excess deaths were up 14% on normal, according to all the official statistics. And of course, now they're much higher than that. And whether you go by COVID-related deaths or indeed excess deaths, we're well over 100,000 now, aren't we? So you know, you were wrong then, and you accept that now, do you, with hindsight?
No. All these statistics can be presented in a number of ways. And seen in the round, the reality is that we've had 4 years in the last 5 that make up the 5-year average of relatively benign performance, certainly with flu being suppressed. And therefore, being within 15% of the 5-year average is not untypical if you look over the last decade or so. You will see that years pop up and down to very significant extents.
Well, hang on, wait a minute. I mean, we're now above 15%. Are you not accepting that excess deaths due to COVID are above 100,000? Are you saying that is inaccurate?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying what I have said in the House of Commons. I have complained about the way that statistics have been presented and information and data has been revealed. I have said that on the record in the House of Commons. No different to what I've said.
Okay, but if you accept that there are more than 100,000 excess deaths, what are you complaining about? I mean, that's a fact, isn't it? And to question that or to talk about hidden agendas, that is fake news, isn't it?
No, I complained about the way that data has been presented, as I have in the House of Commons on the record.
Yeah, but what is your complaint? What is your complaint about? How is it wrong for us to be given these statistics by the Office of National Statistics and other sources, ones which reputable people like Ed Conway and Chris Giles and the Financial Times all have verified? What is wrong about the way it's being presented?
I've already answered your question, even if you didn't like the answer. This data is presented in a particular way. We've seen various aspects of the way that the data was presented by government to Parliament, which has unwound in the days afterwards and had to be represented. It's perfectly legitimate to raise concerns.
You haven't produced any evidence for that. You're making an assertion which is undermining people's perception of the scale of the problem, and you're not telling me. You're saying you're complaining about it, but you're not giving me any evidence of what's been done wrong in your view.
Let's take the example to which I was thinking about at the time, which was, if I remember, in the early autumn when the two chiefs, Chief Scientist and Chief Medical Officer, presented their scenario. And within a couple of days, after work by Professor Hennigan and by the Spectator magazine, that unwound and had to be represented. And I raised that in Parliament. I've complained about the way that statistics have been...
Except the problem is that Professor Hennigan and his predictions are now totally discredited. And he's gone rather silent. And indeed, the Spectator that was championing that, events, the deaths, the real people dying, the real people getting long COVID, have disproved your claims that these statistics were being misrepresented. And therefore, that's why Michael Gove is asking you to apologise. Are you prepared to apologise?
My comments were perfectly legitimate at the time. And that's the point. What may have changed subsequently is immaterial. You're asking me to comment on things that were said in November, which were perfectly legitimate then. Yes, things have changed.
Well, that's questionable, but you accept things have changed. So with hindsight, go back to my earlier question, do you now regret giving those interviews, and will you apologise for them, as Michael Gove has asked?
No, the complaint was legitimate at the time, the way that statistics were being presented. Even if subsequently deaths have ballooned, and they have, at the time, those comments were perfectly legitimate.
The Chief Whip has asked you to meet with scientific advisors, presumably he's thinking of people like Jonathan Van Tam and Chris Whitty and Valence. Have you met with them? Are you prepared to meet with them?
Absolutely, I'll meet with anyone.
Yes, but are you prepared to meet with those people and to accept the briefings that they give you?
Absolutely.
And are there any plans now for that to take place imminently?
Not that I'm yet aware of.
And do you fear that you might be suspended from the Conservative Party, because there's also been criticism from the party hierarchy for your comments?
Well, that would be thought crime.
But I mean, have you been told that you are in danger of suspension if you don't change?
I have not.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you about vaccinations, because, as you know, the two people we showed you being interviewed with in that report, Louise Canfield and Del Bigtree, are both campaigners against vaccines. Would you, when the opportunity arises, will you have personally a COVID vaccine?
Yes, absolutely. I'm evangelical in my support for vaccination. That was clear from the question that I put to the Prime Minister yesterday. Even the most cursory examination of the blogs on my website will see my enthusiasm for the vaccination programme. Again, things that I've said in Parliament.
And so, again, do you then regret the fact that you, by appearing, and we saw Del Bigtree talking about how honoured he was to speak to you and the rest, do you regret that you helped, actually give credibility to those organisations which you spoke to?
I don't believe I have given credibility. I spoke to them on the issue of the lockdown. We never touched on the issue of vaccination. I had no idea that Del Bigtree, who I'd never heard of before, had any previous on vaccination. So the reality is I stuck to the brief that I was given. I was asked about lockdown, and I talked about lockdown.
What do you say to people who are now going into hospitals and protesting and saying that patients should be released and that there's no such thing as COVID?
I think they're nutty.
Nutty?
Nutty, yes. It's clear that there is COVID. It's clear that we have a major health problem, but I dispute the chosen policies that we've dealt with. It's perfectly legitimate. There's nothing that I have said in these encounters that I'm not on the record as having said in Parliament.
Okay, and would you do an interview again with Dale Bigtree or Save Our Rights UK?
I would be rather cautious about that.
And just finally, yesterday, the announcements from the Prime Minister amount to an extension of this third lockdown into March. Do you support that in the present circumstances?
No, I've been against lockdown from the start. But I did think we'd made significant progress yesterday with the Prime Minister announcing that he would be producing the plan. And what I thought was particularly helpful from the Prime Minister yesterday was he assured me that there would be no mission creep beyond the need to reduce hospital admissions, that the key metric here is progress in vaccination, particularly with the vulnerable groups who would likely to be hospitalised if they were to become infected. That is the key to ending the lockdown.
What about wearing masks in public places? Do you support that?
I've never supported that. I made that clear from absolutely the first. I believe government did it for the best of possible motives, but I disagree with it. I voted against it. But hey, it's a democracy. I was on the losing side, and so I wear my mask as required.
So Desmond, you're a public servant, you've been a minister, no one would question your integrity, but it does seem that your message to the public is going against the very traditional one of better safe than sorry.
Well, the fact is, we are sorry. The reality is that we've been in some form of lockdown in 3 iterations throughout almost the last year, and still we have 100,000 deaths. And we have done enormous damage to our children's education and to the economy. So it's perfectly legitimate for me as a politician to make a counter-argument, to have said that actually I think there were different things, different policy options that we should have pursued. And to, even if I speak for a minority, do we still believe in freedom of expression in this country or not? I mean, you've raised the possibility of my being suspended for saying these things.
Well, that's up to your party, but we're very happy to hear your views. But I do want to put it to you that had you been listened to, most scientific analysis would be that many, many more people would have died or had this serious disease as a result. And therefore, many people might think you might regret some of your past comments.
Well, that is a perfectly legitimate debate to have. But equally, there are literally scores of thousands who have, including clinicians and scientists, who signed the Great Barrington Declaration. It's an argument, a legitimate argument to be had.
Well, it was the argument about Sweden, for example, but we know Sweden now has had very bad outcomes. So, I'm just puzzled by, if you like, your refusal to benefit from hindsight.
Well, I've just raised hindsight to you. We have had lockdowns, and we've had 100,000 deaths, and we've had huge damage to our economy and the life chances of young people and our children's education. That strikes me as perfectly legitimate to say, was there another way of having gone about this?
OK, so just on that point of Michael Gove's, he's asked you to apologise for your past comments. Are you prepared to do that?
I have a great deal of respect for Michael Gove. On occasion, I backed him for the leadership, and I have worked with him closely in the Cameron administration, and I will always reflect on his comments. But I'm not clear as to what I'm being asked to apologise for. And I just wonder if he has fallen for that Sky News headline, "Senior Tory tells anti-vaxxers to carry on," and indicates his support, which is a monstrous distortion of the truth.
So Desmond Swayne, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, let's go now to our political correspondent, Joe Pike. Does that draw a line under the matter, do you think, Joe?
I don't think it does. If you wanted to summarise that interview with Sir Desmond, I suppose it was no apologies, no regrets. The only regret really seemed to be the fuss that all of this has caused. The problem for Boris Johnson is Michael Gove has made it very clear what he should do, which is to apologise and retract those comments. Sir Desmond doesn't seem to want to do that. And therefore, what does Boris Johnson do next? There is pressure on him now, the Prime Minister, to suspend the whip from Sir Desmond, even though Michael Gove didn't say that would necessarily be the next step. The problem Boris Johnson has is, firstly, the government have been focusing on compliance on the key public health messages so much over the past few weeks, and we do see these very worrying statistics over the past few weeks in terms of hospitalisations and deaths. But in contrast, Boris Johnson knows that Sir Desmond's views on lockdown restrictions are shared by other backbenchers. There are other Conservatives who are worried about the impact on the economy and also the impact on personal freedoms. Of course, there is this COVID recovery group led by the former Chief Whip Mark Harper and also Steve Baker, a prominent Brexiteer. So now I suppose it is over to Boris Johnson to decide what to do next, and his Chief Whip. But as you say, if Sir Desmond wanted to draw a line under this whole saga, I think he's